everyone, welcome to Buglife's winter webinar series. This evening's talk is To Be a Flower with Jeff Ollerton. It's the third in our winter webinar series. We kicked off with Dave Golson talking about insect declines. Last week we had Bridget Strawbridge talking about wildlife gardening, and tonight we're joined by Jeff Ollerton to talk about the flowers part in the role of in their relationship with pollinators. Welcome to Buglife. We are the organisation hosting this webinar this evening. My name's Kate Jones. I'm a conservation officer with Buglife. I run the Severn B-Lines Project, which is delivering habitat creation work in Shropshire. I'm joined by Caitlin Elverson, who is the B-Lines intern on the project, and she is going to be doing an introduction for you this evening, just to what we're doing on the ground, what B-Lines are and how you can get involved. I will just say at this point, we are recording this webinar, so keep your cameras and your microphones turned off. This will be put on YouTube later for participants that couldn't make it. But without further ado, I will hand over to Caitlin so that she can do a quick rundown of what Severn B-Lines is, what we're doing here in Shropshire, and then we'll move on to Jeff's talk.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yes, so welcome to our winter webinar series. So we've been running this series of events and webinars for about a month or so, or just over, well, a couple of months now. And yes, Jess being our all but one talk in this series. So it's just been a collection of guest speakers, encouraging people or educating people about what they can do for pollinators on their own patch, really. So let me get this going. Yes, as Kate's mentioned, we're from the Severn B-Lines Project. So I am the B-Lines intern, and I'm here to just give you a bit of a background of who we are, what we're up to, and you know, how we've kind of got to this stage, really. So who are Buglife? Buglife used to be called the Invertebrate Conservation Trust a while back. And now, hopefully you'll agree with the catchier Buglife. We are the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrate species, from the tiniest of little guys that you can barely see to the biggest stuff, and even you know, lobsters and all that kind of stuff, or marine animals that you know, we maybe don't see as much on land. And our aim is to stop invertebrate extinctions and achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates. And just one of the many ways that Buglife is achieving this is through our B-Lines project. So the B stands for biodiversity. So biodiversity for all things, not just insects. But obviously the focus for Buglife is those lovely little guys that sometimes get quite a bit of a bad rep. So B-Lines, you can see the lovely map of the UK there, are a result of about a 10-year mapping process that identified and mapped all of the important invertebrate areas in the UK. So triple SIs, you know, sites of special scientific interest, nature reserves, or just, you know, beautiful wildflower habitats that were good for insects, but also specifically pollinators. So this insect highway network covers all across the UK. Obviously, we're working specifically in Shropshire. But if just 10% of these 3-kilometre wide strips were filled in with wildflower rich habitat, we would go a long way to achieving those sustainable populations of pollinators that Buglife are trying to achieve. And we'd end up with a lot of beautiful wildflower habitat along the way. This would be a lovely video, but I'm gonna spare you the jitteryness because we've had a bit of issues for the last few, but it is on YouTube, as you can see, and you know, we'll put out some links at the end if you would like to just spare a couple of minutes. That just gives you a summary of what B-Lines is and are, but I will jump quite swiftly to what the Severn B-Lines project is. So the area of Severn B-Lines is right on there, and the map that you can see. So the current project, I joined the project about in May, kind of middle of May last year, and Kate started a little bit earlier in March, but running up until the end of June this year. We've been working from, I don't know if you can see on that map there, from Bridgnorth to Telford and a little bit further up past Shrewsbury. And basically, we're the B-Lines project on the ground creating and restoring wildflower habitat across gardens, parks, amenity grasslands, agricultural and arable margins, across our project sites in Shropshire. We've worked with some fantastic partners, of course the Shropshire Wildlife Trust being our main delivery partner for this year, the Telford and Wrekin Council, Bridgnorth Town Council, and we're all funded through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund through DEFRA, administered by the National Natural Heritage Fund. But of course, Kate and I can't do this all by ourselves, and putting people at the heart of the project is, is kind of what B-Lines is all about. We couldn't do this without you and without your help. So we've been running some workshops, training events. Last week we just did some scything, which was super cool on one of our project sites in Bridgnorth, cutting the grass on well meadows to give the wildflowers that we've seeded there the best chance for when they start to come up in spring. You can see that there's some other seeding days going on here, some green hay spreading, some other pollinator workshops where we've been telling people how to identify bees and other, quite secretive pollinators like hoverflies. That there is Nigel Jones. He's a local entomologist in Shropshire. So all of this great stuff that's teaching you guys out there all about pollinators and what to do with them, or what to do for them, I should say. And the main thing that we're encouraging people to do is to add their own project to the B-Lines map. So you can do this by going on to Buglife, the Buglife website, and just clicking on the B-Lines page. If you've got something going on in your garden or your community, and you're planting wildflowers or anything that's going to benefit pollinators, we want to know about it, especially if you're in one of these B-Lines sections. Or even if you're not, everything on the map or the whole of UK contributes to helping pollinators and boosting their numbers so we can benefit from them for years to come. So far we've restored about 8.5 hectares of grassland with the Severn B-Lines project, and we're hoping to boost that, and hopefully we'll have a lot more projects in Shropshire as a result of this webinar and learning a little bit more about flowers themselves and more about pollinators. So with that, I will stop sharing and I will pass back to Kate, who will introduce our lovely guest speaker for this evening.
Hello everyone. Thanks, Caitlin, for that. That was great. Yeah, so as you can see, we've got quite a big task on our hands. To fill in those B-lines, we need to start achieving landscape connectivity, we need to fill in those B-lines by about 10%. On the ground, that looks like 300 hectares per 10 kilometre stretch. In this project, we're going to be delivering about 18 hectares. So you can see that even though Buglife are on the ground delivering projects, we need everyone's help. So if you're a farmer or you work for a council, or you're a gardener, whatever you can do on your own land to introduce more wildflowers, more habitat, bare ground. There's lots of different things that pollinators need. There's lots more resources on our website. Please do get involved and log it on our website. But now I'm going to pass over to Jeff Ollerton, who's an ecologist and author of this brilliant book, Pollinators and Pollination. And he is going to be talking about the flowers' role, the plants' role in pollination, what they do to attract their pollinators. If anybody's been watching Green Planet, which I think has just been a really groundbreaking program for highlighting plant behaviour, which I found fascinating, then I think this talk is going to be brilliant if that's been up your street. So thank you, Jeff, for coming to speak for us this evening, and I shall pass over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Caitlin, for the introduction. It's great to see the B-Lines project just going from strength to strength. I remember when it was first set up on a national scale, I helped with the mapping of the B-Lines across part of the East Midlands when I was living there. And yeah, it's a very, very worthwhile thing to be involved with. So, as mentioned, I am going to focus more on the flower side of the equation, partly because I think Sometimes we neglect the flower side. We think of flowers as just being there for pollinators, just being a resource for pollinators, as opposed to being a fundamental part of biodiversity in and of themselves. And I hope that I'll convince you by the end of this talk that flowers are worth studying in their own right, that they are inherently fascinating. And the title here, To Be a Flower, is actually chapter 3 in my book. So part of what I'm talking about today is based on what's in the book. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on. This is what I'm going to be talking excuse me, about today. I'm going to talk about what flowers are and where they came from. What's the origin of flowers? I'm going to say a little bit about how flowers function and how they reward pollinators. I'm going to talk about some case studies from my own research, some of the work that I've been doing over the last 30 years or so that I've been studying pollinators, and think specifically about the ways in which flowers actually manipulate pollinators. Sometimes we think of flowers perhaps as being these passive organs or set of organs that sit there and wait for something to happen to them, wait for pollinators to arrive. But as I'll again hopefully convince you, there's a lot more to it than that. And then at the end, I'm going to think about this question: why is it important? Why is it important that we understand flower biology, excuse me, and behaviour? Why have I spent 30 years studying this? So what are flowers, and where do they come from? Well, if we were to define flowers in broad terms, we can think of them as collections of plant organs that function to ensure the reproduction of flowering plants. There's a sort of a circularity to that argument, I guess, that flowers are something that flowering plants have. Another name for the flowering plants, and one that I'll use throughout the talk, are the angiosperms. Non-flowering seed plants, the gymnosperms, have equivalent reproductive structures that are not technically flowers. Though actually some botanists get into very in-depth conversations with one another as to whether flowers are only found in the flowering plants, or whether some of the gymnosperms actually have flowers as well. It's a highly technical argument that we won't be going into tonight. But that's for the sake of our argument, or the sake of our talk, that's how we're going to define flowers. And the diversity of flower size, shape, color, scent, and behavior, because as I'll show you in a moment, flowers certainly have behavior. All of that has evolved in the main to attract pollinators. Probably for about 90% of the flowering plants, it's to attract pollinators. But for about 10%, or just under 10%, it's to disperse pollen on the wind, in the case of wind pollination, or within water currents in the case of water pollinated plants. And this is the diversity that we are talking about. This is the just a snapshot of some of the diversity of flowers and inflorescences, collections of flowers that we can find in nature. And this is one of the things that really fascinates me. It's just how diverse flowers are, and how that diversity has come about. And I was talking with a friend of mine today, and mentioning that actually I've got a life list of botanic gardens that I visit. I'm a bit of an addict to botanic gardens, and one of the reasons I like going to botanic gardens is because I always see something new. That I always see flowers that I've never seen before, and there seems an almost endless variety. all of that variety is based on a relatively simple and straightforward ground plan, or as the Germans call it, a bough plan. The bough plan of a flower relates to the way in which the organs are arranged within the flower. In simple terms, we have sepals on the outside, which are sterile in the sense that they don't take an active part in reproduction, and usually their role is to protect the developing flower in the bud. Next comes a whorl of petals, which are likewise sterile. They don't actively take part in reproduction. Then we have the male parts, the stamens, which have the anthers containing the pollen, and then the stigma and the style and the ovary, the female parts in the very center. And the basic ground plan for flowers and the ancestral form for flowers is that they're hermaphrodite. They have both male and female sex expression. However, there is a lot of variation on that theme. In some cases, you have flowers where it's not possible to distinguish between petals and sepals, and we collectively term those tepals or tepals, and so there's just a single whorl of structures. We also have flowers in which the female parts are missing. There's only the anthers and then petals and sepals, and so those flowers are male, or alternatively, in which the anthers and the stamens, the male parts are missing, and only the female parts are present, and those flowers are functionally female. And the arrangement of single-sex flowers like this again can be quite complex. So if you look at that bottom row of diagrams there, on the left-hand side you've got a plant where the plant itself is hermaphrodite, but there are male flowers at the top of the plant and there are female flowers at the bottom. The second example there, you've got a population of plants in which there are separate male and female individuals of varying proportions, quite often 50-50, though not always. And on the right-hand side, the third example there, you have an individual that has female flowers and male flowers separate, and then another individual that is all female. And you can also have the opposite, where you have hermaphrodite individuals and female individuals, and there's every possible combination in between. It can be extraordinarily complex. You also get plants in which the flowers act collectively as a group to function as a single flower. And the dandelion and the daisy family, the Asteraceae, is probably the best example of this, where collections of flowers are presented as a single flower head, and it functions as a single flower. And in the case of some members of the daisy family, the flowers on the outside of the flower head are sterile. They just function for attraction. And then you may have male flowers in the next set of flowers going in, and then hermaphrodite flowers in the center. And again, there are various combinations of that. Sorry, it's going backwards. Here we go. And just to give you, that's a little bit abstract, but just to give you an example of some of the complexity here that we're going to be talking about. Here's a plant that many of you will be familiar with, common name Lords and Ladies. It's got other common names, cuckoo pint, for example. It's Arum maculatum in the family Aeraceae, and the Aeraceae family is largely a tropical family. And if you grow house plants, and you've grown house plants like Swiss cheese plant or philodendron as well, all of these are members of the family Aeraceae. It's quite a large family. And we've published various bits of research on this species over the years. And one of the things that we discovered is that it produces a scent which is almost identical to cow dung, and the scent is produced by that long brown sausage-shaped structure in the center of the inflorescence. Again, it isn't a single flower. It attracts its that cow dung attracts its or the cow dung scent attracts its pollinators, which are owl midges in the genus Cycoda, which would normally lay their eggs in animal dung. And they're fooled into thinking that there's going to be a reward inside these flowers. And they come in hoping to lay their eggs there, and they get trapped in this inflated section at the base of the bloom. The flowers, which are arranged at the bottom there, as you can see from the diagram, there's a set of male flowers at the top and then female flowers at the bottom. And the male flowers open first, shower pollen down onto the flies. There's an example of one there covered in pollen, and then the flies are trapped there for 24 hours and then released, and then they go off to pollinate the female flowers, which are at the base of the inflorescence. And actually, it's one of the most specialized plants in the British flora. These midges don't visit any other flowers, and there are no other pollinators known for this particular plant. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these trap pollination strategies a little bit later, but bear in mind the basic principles there. The other variation that you can have on this theme, of course, is a complete absence of any attractive structures at all. So wind-pollinated plants, most of the grasses and sedges, for example, have lost their petals completely. They don't need to invest in attracting pollinators, so they've dispensed with petals completely, and with nectar as well as a reward. And here's an example. Here's a sedge which with flowers which produce massive amounts of pollen, which if any of you are suffer from hay fever, you'll be familiar with the amount of pollen that these sorts of plants can produce. Despite all the variation that we've been talking about there, the order of those organs within the flower is incredibly fixed. It's almost always sterile parts on the outside, male parts next, and then female parts in the center. And of the perhaps 350,000 species of flowering plants, there's less than 10 that are known to have inside-out flowers. Like this is work from Paula Radal and colleagues at Kew, who had identified these small ancient families, Triiridaceae and Hitelidaceae, where some of the species at least have inside-out flowers, with the male parts in the middle and the female parts on the outside. But those are the exception rather than the rule. So when we say ancient, when we talk about ancient families there of plants, how ancient? When did flowers and when did the angiosperms actually evolve? Well, this diagram gives you a sense of that. There's quite a lot going on in this diagram, and I'm certainly not going to go through the whole thing. But this is from an article that I published with a colleague, Casper van der Kooi, in the journal Science last year, where we looked at the origin of flowering plants and their pollinators. And all I want you to take away from this figure is the fact that there is a big discrepancy between the dates where we from the fossil record where we think the flowering plants evolved, and the dates from the molecular analyses of the DNA and the dates that those tell us, of the order of about 100 million years difference. And those are the two parts of the figure that I've underlined in brown there. So the fossil record tells us that flowering plants probably evolved in the latest Cretaceous, perhaps earliest Cretaceous, latest Jurassic kind of period, maybe 160, 170 million years ago. The DNA evidence is telling us that it might have been 210, 20, perhaps even 230 million years ago in the Triassic period. And again, there's a huge debate amongst botanists about which of these figures is correct. But certainly the fossil record tells us that the flowering plants evolved some considerable time ago, but that their diversification and most of the species that have evolved, most of the families that have evolved, have happened actually over the last 100 million years or so. So it's a more recent diversification. And just as an aside on that, one of the old stories that we used to read in textbooks was that it was the evolution of insect pollination which caused the flowering plants to become so successful. And we now know that that's not true, that actually insect pollination evolved in the gymnosperms long before the flowering plants evolved. And this is from fossils from China and Spain and Russia by a number of different authors, really detailed and well preserved fossils showing that various groups of insects, including scorpion flies and snake flies, for example, were actually pollinators even long before the bees evolved. So if we think about the diversity of present-day pollinators, birds and bees and rodents and wasps and bats and flies and beetles and even lizards and cockroaches as well, actually, a lot of that diversity of flowers, of course, is adaptation to attract and reward those pollinators, but in fact, it's also an adaptation to, in many cases, to manipulate the behavior of those pollinators in some really quite sophisticated ways. And that's what I want to move on and talk about next. And I'm going to start with this example here. It's actually one of my favorite flowers, a thing called Deherania smaragdina. It doesn't have a common name as far as I'm aware, I'm afraid. But it's in the primula family, the Primulaceae. And we think, certainly in Europe, of primulas as being small, herbaceous, low-growing plants. But actually in the tropics, they are often shrubs or small trees. And Deherania is a small tree native to Mexico, Central America. The flowers, as you can see, are green. They're actually the same color of the leaves. They're very waxy in texture. They feel like as if they're made out of wax, and they smell of cheese. And this plant's widely grown in botanic gardens. Certainly Oxford Botanic Gardens has it. Kew has it as well. And often it's the smell of the plant that attracts you to it before you even see the flowers. We don't know what the pollinators are. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say perhaps large flies, or possibly even wasps or beetles, but the pollinators are unknown. And actually that's true for the majority of the flowering plants, about 90% of them. We have no information whatsoever on what their pollinators are. Although the flowers themselves are hermaphrodite, they effectively change sex over a few days from male to female. And you can see that in the photograph and in the diagram there. And that you can see that in the male phase of the flower, the stamens are clustered over the top of the stigma, and in fact the stigma isn't receptive at that point. And then over the course of a couple of days, the stamens move backwards slowly to expose the stigma, and it goes into female phase. And the advantage of this, of course, is that it prevents self-pollination and ensures cross-pollination. The other thing you'll probably sorry, excuse me. The other thing you'll probably notice there is that there is a slight color change within the flowers, and that isn't unusual. That's what I want to talk about next. Because most plants, after the flower has ceased to fulfill its function of attracting and rewarding pollinators, the flowers actually drop and wither and die, and of course that makes complete sense. Flowers cost the plant energy and resources to maintain. So, for example, in this Persian silk tree here, these attractive structures are actually stamens, not petals at all. Another variation on a theme. But after the flowers have been pollinated, those stamens wither and cease to be attractive. However, for some plants, for some flowers, they've evolved to actually hold on to their old flowers, and to maintain them in a fresh condition, even after they've fulfilled their function. And that is unusual. It happens in a minority of flowers, but still it's evolved hundreds of different times in many different plant families. And you can actually see some examples here. This is some work by a Japanese colleague of mine, Kaz Ohashi. And that flower on the left there is a Weigela. This will be familiar for some of you from gardens, wildly grown in gardens, which starts out white and then darkens to a pink color, finally becomes this dark purplish red. The one in the middle is a wisteria, which has this yellow patch in the center of the young flowers, and then the older flowers, it'll lose that patch completely. And the one on the right there, the C, is slightly more subtle. It's a Lythrum species in which the flowers don't look as if they change to the human eye, but to an insect eye, looking at this within the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, you can see that the flowers actually go from being very bright to being very dark, signaling to the pollinators that these are old flowers. We can use something called a spectrometer to actually measure the wavelength of reflectance of the flowers, or the proportion of reflectance in different parts of the wavelength. And that's what those graphs are showing, the difference between early and late flowers in their reflectance in different parts of the visible and just into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. This phenomenon of floral color change intrigued me when I encountered it, not for the first time, but certainly in a plant that I'd never seen before, on the island of Tenerife, one of the Canary Islands, and actually one of my very, very favorite places in the world. Between 2003 and 2019, we made about 20 visits there for field work. Some of them were student field trips, others were research field work. But we made about 20 visits to the island. And one of the areas that we focused on was the high altitude forest and shrubland. If you know the island, as you're going up towards Mount Teide, the Cordillera, or the Caldera rather, up at the top there. Tenerife is the second highest island in the world after Hawaii, Big Island, actually, which surprises some people, but there's a very, very steep altitude gradient. You're at about 12,000 feet at the very top of Teide. But the lowest slopes of that high altitude forest are dominated by Pinus canariensis, an endemic pine tree. But there's also a high diversity of shrubs and other perennial plants there, most of which are endemic to the islands there. One of the endemic plants is a thing called the Canary Island wallflower, related to the wallflowers that we grow in gardens. The species is Erysimum scaparium, in the cabbage family, Brassicaceae. And what caught my eye when I first encountered this plant back in 2003 was this flower color change. And what you find is that when the flowers first open, as you can see at the top of that picture on the left there, the flowers when they first open are white, and then over the course of a few days, they become a sort of violet color and gradually turn to quite a dark purple color. And the main pollinator is this solitary bee here, another endemic bee, Anthophora alawardii. And more than 99% of all of the flower visits by pollinators that we've ever seen to this flower has been by mainly females of this species, with very occasional flower visits by other insects. But this is the main pollinator. And over the course of several years, we studied the color change of these flowers from white to violet to purple. And what's happening here is that on the first day, the one or two flowers at the top of the inflorescence are white, and you can see that on this reflectance spectrum here. That white, of course, is composed of all of the colors of the visible spectrum, and that's what you see on this spectrometer graph is a reflectance at all wavelengths. Then, as the flower goes into the violet phase, some of these the middle parts of the spectrum drop out there. And what's happening here is that the flowers start to synthesize a pigment, a type of anthocyanin pigment, actually I think called peodonin, which of course costs energy and resources to synthesize. Again, this is not a passive process by the flowers. They're actively synthesizing this. And then by the time you get to day 4 through to perhaps as long as day 10, the flowers have gone to this darker purple coloration, and these flowers are imposing a cost on the plant as a whole to maintain as fully open, fresh-looking flowers, even though they may have been pollinated. And one of the things that we did, of course, was to study the behaviour of these bees in relation to the flower color change. And if flower position is a measure of age, so 1 or 2 is position 1 or 2 are 1 or 2 days old, 3 through 5 might be 3 to 5 days old, and so on. What we find is that most of the bee visits to the flower happen in the first 2 days of the flower opening, and by the time you get through to day 3, 4, 5, and 6, the number of visits to those flowers declines enormously, so that by the time the flowers are between sort of 6 and 10 days old, the bees don't visit those flowers at all. It's only the young flowers that are being heavily visited. So what's happening here? Well, if you look at the nectar within the flowers, what you find is that in the white flowers you get quite a high volume of nectar, somewhere between sort of 0.4 and 0.6 microliters per flower. In the purple phase, the flowers are producing less than half of that amount of nectar. And also the likelihood of the bees encountering a flower which has no nectar at all increases significantly from a likelihood somewhere between sort of 0 and 10% up to a likelihood of 50 to 60%. So the bees learn that there's more reward in the newly opened white flowers. So the plant is effectively training its pollinator to visit the new, fresh, open flowers. They're manipulating the behavior of the bees. But it still begs the question as to why the old flowers are being kept, why the color change is happening, why are the flowers investing in that? And that's a question that we have some evidence for. We think we can answer. I would like to go back to Tenerife in the next couple of years and investigate this in a bit more detail, but we think we have an answer. And the answer actually is staring at us in this photograph of part of the mountain there. If you look in the bottom left of the photograph, you'll see some clusters of purple plants, and those purple plants are the Canary Island wallflowers. And so from a distance, I mean, here you're talking of a distance of several hundred meters, what a bee would see is a cluster of purple flowers. And there are many other white flowered plants within this community belonging to different plant species, and so the purple actually makes the flowers stand out at a landscape scale. So they're acting as a long distance attractant. And in fact, we tested that idea with an experiment, myself and a couple of students back in about 2006, where we spent time removing all of the purple flowers from plants within a population, and then measuring the number of bee visits. And what we found is that for the larger plants, at least, if you remove all the purple flowers, the number of bee visits to the white flowers significantly decreases. And we had quite a small sample size of plants, as you can see there. I'd like to again, go back and do some more work on that, and suddenly increase the sample size there. That's not the only way in which flowers can affect the behaviour or manipulate the behaviour of their pollinators. Here's another example in which flowers choose when to open and when to expose their pollen and their stigma and nectar to pollinators. This is a plant called Carpobrotus edulis, sometimes called the Hottentot fig, or the Cape fig. It's endemic to South Africa, but has been widely introduced. Again, this was photographed on Tenerife. It also occurs as an invasive species in Cornwall and Devon. But this flower in the middle there, you can see is wide open, and that's because it was a sunny day. A little bit later in the day, some clouds came in, and that inset photograph there is exactly the same flower, but it's closed up because it became cloudy. And so these flowers close up at night, or when it's cloudy, or when it's raining. That ensures that the flowers are protected from the rain. But it also means that the flowers are open when most insects are flying, of course, when it's sunny. And there's quite a number of flowers, and a lot of garden flowers, for example, which do this as well. And again, just as an aside, what looks like petals on this flower are actually modified stamens, modified male reproductive organs, which are sterile, and we refer to them as staminodes. And the petals are very, very small and kind of tucked away underneath the flowers. Here's another example of flowers opening or flowers timing their opening for particular kinds of pollinators. This is a tropical rainforest vine that we studied in Tanzania, actually, on a Tropical Biology Association field course. And a thing called Dictyoflaba lucida. Again, I apologize, it doesn't have a common name. Most plants don't, in fact, but it's moth pollinated, and its flowers open in the evening. And what I did with some students is to measure light intensity using a light meter, and that's the grayish brown dots that you can see, and we're going from about 4 p.m. Through to 10 to 9 there. And of course, it being the tropics, the sun sets very, very quickly. So as the sun is setting, we're losing light very, very quickly, so that by the time we get to about 6:30 in the evening, all of the natural daylight has gone. And at the same time, the flowers are opening. This is a graph of the cumulative numbers of flowers that opened on this plant, 30 in total. So these flowers are opening pretty much at a similar kind of rate to the rate of that darkness is falling. And so by the time you get to about 6:45 in the evening, all of the flowers that are going to open on this plant are open. It's starting to produce a very, very strong, heady scent, which you can smell, tens of meters away through the forest, and the moths are starting to come in to pollinate the flowers. That plant, Dictyoflaba lucida, belongs to my favorite plant family. It's a plant family that I've studied for around 30 years now, a family called the Apocynaceae, the dogbane and milkweed family. And this family has held my fascination for quite a number of reasons. We've published quite a lot of research papers on it. But it's the 10th largest family of flowering plants, more than 5,350 described species, and more being described every year. And as you can see from that picture there, which comes from a paper that we published in 2019, which looked at the diversity of pollination systems within the family, the flowers are hugely variable and diverse. And there's still an enormous amount to discover about these plants. And just to give you one example, I said I was going to come back to this trap pollination strategy that is described earlier for lords and ladies. Well, this is a group within the milkweeds, within that family, in which some of the species are succulents, mainly desert succulent plants, similar in form to cacti, but with very, very different flowers. Whereas others are either tuberous or twining plants, belonging to taxonomically to a different group, a group called Ceropegia. So the succulents, we call them the stapeliids. It's a genus Stapelia and its relatives. The other group are Ceropegia. And again, if any of you grow house plants and you've ever grown a plant that's called string of hearts, that's a species of Ceropegia. And if you look at the flowers, there's small, quite oddly shaped flowers. You'll see that they have this sort of tubular form, and again they trap their pollinators there temporarily. And there's this group collectively belongs to a single evolutionary lineage. They share a common ancestor, perhaps 20 or 30 million years ago. And all 720 species or so are fly pollinated, but the stapeliids are what we might term have an open strategy. So the flowers, the flies come into the flowers, they search for nectar. Often these things are quite unpleasantly scented. We sometimes call them carrion flowers, but they can smell of urine and feces and rotten flesh and so on. But they'll search for some nectar there, won't find it, and then will fly off. Whereas the trap pollination strategy, similar to lords and ladies, the flies get trapped for a period of 24 hours before they're released. And what's interesting here is that these two strategies, from an open fly pollinated strategy through to a trap pollination strategy, has evolved multiple times. It's evolved from open to trap and from trap to open. It's flipped backwards and forwards over time. And the simple answer is we don't know why that's the case. What is the advantage of having open pollination versus trap pollination, or trap pollination versus open pollination under different circumstances? So I hope I've convinced you that in the first part of this talk as to the fact that these flowers show behaviour, that plants are not passive participants within pollination. They time their flower opening, they have staggered male and female function. There's flowering time during the season as well, of course. So their floral schedules vary according to particular kinds of pollinators. We haven't touched on breeding system and self-incompatibility and so on, but we know that flowers have selective acceptance of pollen, and they will reject poor quality pollen or pollen from their own flowers, and sometimes they'll reject seeds even after they've been fertilized. Again, if the male pollen donor was poor quality. And then there's all sorts of manipulation of pollinator behavior. We've talked about the trap flowers, and then there's dynamic replenishment of nectar and floral color change and so on. So there's all sorts of ways in which they're manipulating their pollinators. But a question, of course, is why does it matter? Why have I devoted 30 years of my life to studying this, and actually probably longer than that, because I was interested in this sort of thing even as a child. But certainly 30 years of my professional life I've devoted to studying flowers and their pollinators. Why is it important? Well, first of all, curiosity. I think they're inherently fascinating. I hope some of the stories I've told this evening has that you found them fascinating, and that it's encouraged you to learn more about these flowers. But on a more fundamental level, I think, understanding how flowers work, how they manipulate their pollinators, gives us information that can help both in the conservation of plants and of their pollinators, which of course is what Buglife is all about. I mean, again, on a very simple level, we use flowers for identifying and classifying plants much more than organs such as leaves or stems and roots. Flowers within a group of plants, a genus or a family, for example, vary at a fundamental level much less than things like leaves and stems and roots. But then just, appreciating something like the fact that simple flowers rather than double flowers, fussy overbred cultivars, are best in gardens and in urban planting, because of the way that they interact with the pollinators, and the fact that the pollinators can learn to use those simple flowers in ways that they can't with fussy overbred cultivars. And then finally there's lots and lots of interest at the moment in the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which of course apply to all countries, not just to developing countries. And many of us have long argued that it's biodiversity that underpins most of the SDGs, either directly or indirectly, and because most of the plants on the planet are flowering plants, both in terms of diversity and in terms of abundance, those plant-pollinator interactions are underpinning a significant amount of the terrestrial biodiversity, at least, which is then underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals. So things like health and well-being and combating climate change and so on. There's a lot of talk about tree planting. Even in Britain, something like 70% of our native trees are insect pollinated. And of course, there's a direct role of plant-pollinator interactions in food security and in the global agricultural economy. And one really good example, which is close to my heart because I am very fond of coffee. In fact, I've got a cup of coffee here at the moment. If you excuse me for a minute. But coffee as a global crop is incredibly important to developing countries, to tropical countries. It's only grown in the tropics. The export value of coffee to countries like Ethiopia and some of the South American countries, Brazil and so on, is more than $80 billion per year. And the global coffee industry employs something like 125 million people, most of whom are small-scale agriculture or small-scale farmers, because most coffee production is done on a relatively small scale. And one of the things I calculated for the book is that at the moment the global coffee industry relies on something like 25 trillion, so 25 million billion flower visits by bees and other pollinators to sustain that production. And as you can see from that graph, that's increasing exponentially at the moment, increasing year on year. Which brings us back home, really, to B-Lines and some of the work that organisations like Buglife and the Wildlife Trust are doing, because again, I think a deep understanding of how plants flower and the behaviour of those flowers over the course of a season can help us with conservation of pollinators in, for example, farmland or other areas where we might be planting hedges of native and naturalized plant species. Often when we're talking about planting for pollinators, we're talking about planting wildflower meadows, where which are great, and they're beautiful, and grasslands and meadows are important. But so too is the woody vegetation within hedgerows and woodland edges. Again, a high proportion of which is insect pollinated, a high proportion of which produces nectar and pollen for pollinators. And as you can see from this figure here, if you choose the right mix of woody and climbing plants within a hedgerow, or establishing a small coppice, for example, you can have insect pollinated plants in flower all the way from February through to November, and that's becoming increasingly important with climate change and with winter active bumblebees that we know are becoming more and more common, for example. So understanding flowers and floral behavior at this sort of level, seasonal level, I think can be really, really important. I've thrown that quote in there from Stephen Falk, who many of you will know is probably one of Britain's best entomologists. That quite often we'll look at a field of flowers, field of dandelions, for example, but a single goat willow will probably produce the equivalent nectar and pollen of a dandelion-filled field. So he says it punches above its weight. I'm going to leave it there and just really summarize with 5 bullet points that I hope I've shown you that every flower has a history. They've all evolved from something. Every flower fundamentally is the same, but also every flower is different. The bough plan is the same, but there's huge variation around that basic plan. But every flower has a story to tell. If you look at the detailed ecology and biology of the flowers, you can tell a story there. And every plant and every flower has behavior. Again, it's something which botanists sometimes argue about with zoologists, but I'm firmly of the opinion that flowers have behavior. And hopefully every flower and the pollinators that service them has a future as well. So if that's inspired you, that's my website there. You can find out a bit more about the work that I do. I've got a blog there. I post on the blog a couple of times a month at least. One of my latest blogs is about valuing nature and valuing guitars, which, if that intrigues you, go and have a look at it. And there is the book Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society, which came out at the beginning of last year. Pelagic Publishing produced that book. Available through Pelagic or any other online book retailer, or maybe even go into a bookshop and order it. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
That was, oh, sorry. Always the case with meetings, isn't it? Oh no, thank you very much, Dev. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry, I'll take my glasses off there. Yes, thank you so much. I've certainly, it'll never cease to amaze me what plants are capable of and what they can do. And hopefully I'll speak for everybody else on the webinar this evening. Just before we start off, or looking through what Kate's found question-wise, it would really mean a lot to us if we could grab a bit of feedback from you from this evening's webinar. So I will be popping a link in the chat and sending out an email to everybody after the webinar. So if you could just spare a couple of minutes for us to fill in 7 questions we would really appreciate it. It keeps these webinars going and helps us know where we can improve. Kate, have we accumulated some good questions for Jeff this evening?
We have, yes. I've kind of grouped them. I apologise for any Latin names that I butcher whilst reading these questions. I think the first thing that really got people talking was the fact that pollinators evolved before flowering plants, before the angiosperms. And there was a couple of questions of so how did that evolution occur before the flowering plants? And I think it was Rebecca that asked, she didn't realize that pollination was so sophisticated pre-flowers. And were flowers the origin of plants relying on pollinators to reproduce?
No, not at all. So the non-flowering seed plants that we collectively call gymnosperms are a hugely variable group of plants that are only distantly related to each other. So you've got things like conifers. We think of the standard gymnosperm as being a conifer, but that's only one group. I mean, there's the cycads as well, which look vaguely fern-like, but actually seed plants. There's Welwitschia from the Namibian desert, which is this strange, ancient-looking plant. There's some rainforest climbers as well. There's a thing called a phedra. And all of these are only distantly related to each other, but they're more closely related to each other than they are to the flowering plants. And actually quite a high proportion of those, maybe about 30% of the species within the extant gymnosperms, are insect pollinated. If you go back into the past, 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago, those groups were much more diverse than they are at the moment, but over time they've been outcompeted by the flowering plants. But the ancestors of those gymnosperms were themselves insect pollinated. So the origin of insect pollination goes back way before the flowering plants evolved. How did it all kick off? How did it all start? That's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. We can think of all kinds of scenarios, and clearly there's some advantage there to being insect pollinated. But one of the problems is we're relying on the fossil record here, and we know that the fossil record is incomplete, and we know that interactions between species very rarely are preserved in the fossil record. Occasionally it is. Some of that work that I talked about from China and Spain and so on. Some of that involves insect compressions, or sometimes insects in amber, where you can see pollen grains on them, so you know that they've been visiting flowers, or they've been visiting gymnosperms, because the pollen is very different. But we don't know exactly how it started, but it did start a long time before the flowering plants.
There was a follow-up question to that from I'm afraid I'm very old school, and I've just written the questions down on my notepad, so I haven't got everyone's names. Somebody asked, do pollinators still visit wind pollinated plants? And if so, do those plants have a defense? Do they need a defense against that? Do they have a defense against that?
So yeah, the answer is yes, they do visit. Bees in particular visit wind pollinated flowers. Honeybees, for example, will often visit grasses, particularly if there's not much else in flower at the time. And what they're collecting is pollen, of course. So what we're talking about here, because wind-pollinated plants don't produce nectar by definition, what we're talking about here is defense of pollen. And in most cases, wind-pollinated plants don't bother to defend their pollen, because it's so abundant. They're producing so much of it that to lose even a few thousands or tens of thousands of pollen grains to honeybees, compared to the tens of millions of pollen grains that they're producing, it wouldn't make a huge difference. There are some examples, some quite intriguing examples of flowers that seem to be producing a scent to repel pollen thieves. And the best example in the British flora is common elder, Sambucus, which produces these big, open, quite musky smelling flowers. If you've ever drunk elderflower champagne or cordial, you'll know what that smell is like. But I've spent a lot of time looking at insects on those flowers, and the fact is that they don't visit, insects don't visit very often, certainly not in comparison to something like a hogweed or a cow parsley. And if you on a warm, dry early summer's day, if you shake one of those inflorescences, big clouds of pollen come off. And elder produces a lot of pollen, and it's mostly wind pollinated. And I have a theory that the scent is actually to deter pollen collecting bees. Now, there is an alternative theory. Some really interesting work has come out of Kew in the last couple of years, showing that thrips, tiny little thrips, might actually also be playing a role in pollination. But it's a really, really complex story. And this is a very common, ubiquitous, well-known plant in the British countryside, but even now we don't fully understand its reproductive strategy.
The other thing that really got people talking was your studies on the canary wallflower. But before I go into that, there was kind of an open-ended ask really about somebody saying, could you talk a bit about extra floral nectaries? And I suppose that's a question of, I'm not sure what the question was. They've just put very mysterious. So what maybe it was about around what their function is, or
so extra floral nectaries, as the name suggests, are nectaries that are found outside of flowers, and quite often they're found on stems or leaves, and they have a range of functions, but most of the time the function is not to attract pollinators. The function is to reward predatory insects, particularly ants, but also sometimes beetles. So some of the vetches, for example, meadow vetchling and so on, have small dark patches at the base of their leaves. So do runner beans as well. If you've ever grown runner beans in the garden, you see these dark patches there, and those are extra floral nectaries, and the ants come up and they feed on those nectaries, and at the same time remove caterpillars and grubs and predatory herbivorous insects. So it's a way of rewarding predators to do a job. And so it's another good example of how plants can manipulate the behavior of animals. Plants are pretty sneaky.
I'm diverting a little bit on my own question here, but in Bridget's talk, she talked a lot about floral oils as well. And I hadn't really heard about those talked about before. Are those another strategy that plants are employing?
Yeah, so when we think about flowers rewarding pollinators, nectar, of course, which is a sugar solution, though it's more complicated than that. There's amino acids and various things in there. Nectar is very often produced as a reward. Pollen is also offered as a reward. The poppies, for example, which are mainly bee pollinated, they don't produce any nectar at all. They just produce lots and lots of pollen, and the pollen is a reward for the bees. But then, yeah, there are some flowers which produce a nutritious oil, which is collected again by bees and taken back and fed to larvae, not honeybees, and some quite specialist solitary bees. There are other flowers which produce resin as a reward, and the resin is used by bees for constructing their nests. Some flowers produce heat as a reward. So quite often bowl-shaped flowers, such as buttercups, you'll see flies sitting in there early in the morning, And what they're doing is warming up. If you think about the parabolic shape of a buttercup flower, it's directing all the heat, reflecting the heat and directing it back into the center of the flower. Now that does two things. One, it speeds up the rate of seed production within the flower, but it also acts as a reward for the pollinators, because they can warm up earlier in the day rather. So yeah, there's a whole range of different types of rewards that are being offered.
Fascinatingly complex systems going on right outside. Yeah. Right, so I'll get onto the canary wallflower then. So I think somebody just wanted to clarify, did the flowers change colour as a result of pollination, or was it just getting older? Was it critical that they were pollinated, or would they change colour or just if they got older, even if they weren't pollinated?
That's a really good question. There are some flowers which have what is called an inducible flower color change. So the flower color change is induced by being pollinated. But there are others where it's non-inducible. That is to say, the flower color change happens regardless. And we did some experiments where we bagged inflorescences and looked at the flower color change. And what we discovered is that the color change happens in exactly the same way, regardless of whether they've been pollinated or not. So it's a non-inducible change. It's a good question. But both strategies exist.
Now, this is going to be one of those things where I possibly mispronounced the Latin name. So again, it's about color change during or after pollination. And is this what happens with Victoria cruzianza or Amazonica too? Is which I'm assuming, I don't know what that plant is. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, it's one of the big tropical water lilies.
Right.
It's yeah, one of the ones with the big pads that yeah, Amazonica, as the name suggests, the South American. Yes, I think that does have a flower color change. Yeah, is a short answer. It is widespread across the flowering plants. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of different species do it, and those are the ones that we've studied. And you know, as I showed from that image from the paper by Kazuhashi, some plants are doing it, and we can't see it because we can't see in that part of the spectrum. So it is really common. But yeah, Victoria water lilies do it.
Again, back to the canary wallflower. Somebody was interested in perhaps was that strategy employed in a place where there was a lack of herbivores, so that the plants could keep. Is it less common when there's high herbivore density to keep the old flowers, as there might be grazing pressure?
Another good question. I mean, yeah, that is true. The Canary Islands historically didn't have grazers. Well, that's not strictly true. One of the a really common herbivore, and a surprising herbivore, native herbivore at that altitude, are lizards. Some of the endemic large lizard species, which will eat flowers, and they're mainly after the nectar, because it's a very dry, hot environment up there. So I don't think so. You find this this color change behavior everywhere. You know, places where there's lots of herbivores, places where there's not many herbivores at all. So yeah, I don't think so. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think so.
There's a question here that might be, I don't know, it could be a little open-ended. It starts off with, how do flowers open and close? And for example, the cuckoo pint holding on to the owl midges. Yeah. Is there a process? How do they release them again? And how does the, odd way to phrase it, how does the plant know how long they've been in there, or is it just a timed? How does that happen?
It's just a time thing. Again, it happens regardless of whether there are any insects in there at all. I guess it's I don't know for certain, but I guess it's a kind of a circadian rhythm sort of idea. There's a set time at which these things happen. The inflorescences open, they attract the pollinators, and then I mean, the actual mechanism by which they trap them is that there's a ring of hairs above the male flowers, which allow the flies to go through, but don't allow them to come back up. And the inside of that chamber is coated in wax and is very, very slippy. So these things are scrabbling, trying to get out. They can't get out. After 24 hours, those hairs wither and fall, and the wax starts to break down, and then allows them to come back up. There's a closely related genus of plants, mainly from Asia, but there's one or two North American species called Aracema, which employs a very similar strategy, but the plants have separate male and female individuals, and in fact, individuals can switch between being male and female over the course of a few years. But the male individuals have a similar kind of structure with a hole at the bottom, and that hole opens up and allows the pollinators to go to leave after 24 hours. The female structures, they're called a spathe. The female spathes don't have that hole, so the flies can get in and they pollinate, but they can't get out again. And that seems to be a way of reducing, for plants to reduce the likelihood that neighbors are going to get pollinated. So there's less competition between their offspring over time. So they're lethal traps. It's the only known example of flowers or plants which kill their pollinators.
So this is another hard one to phrase, really. And I suppose it's a question about evolution, really, and it's the process of synchronization of specialized plants with their pollinators and how they reach those systems. Again, I'm not sure if that person is talking about length of time or how that comes about, but I guess that's could be many complex reasons.
I'm not sure what the question is there. Sorry, I was.
No, it was.
Can you repeat it slightly differently? I was actually distracted because I was looking at a question there, which I thought was the same question, but it turns out it wasn't the same question. So sorry, Kate. Please repeat.
No, that's okay. So literally, to read it out, I'd like to know how specialized plant and pollinator systems synchronize to each other. Right.
Okay. That very, very much depends upon the system that we're talking about. I mean, if you think about it this way, if a bee specializes on just visiting a flower, or a flower specializes just on being pollinated by a bee, both of those species are increasing the likelihood of them going extinct. So if the bee goes extinct, the flower goes extinct. The flower goes extinct, the bee goes extinct. And if you look at it on a sort of community level, and if you were to, say, go into one of your B-Lines meadows and look at all of the different types of flowers, and then look at all of the pollinators of those flowers, and then to sort of map it out, what you would find is that the generalist plants, those that are visited by lots and lots of different types of pollinators, they would be visited by generalist pollinators and specialist pollinators. So the specialists specialize on the generalists. And likewise, if you look at the generalist pollinators, the generalists visit the generalist plants, and they visit the generalist flowers. And it's, I won't get into the technical details, but it's a a community structure that we call nestedness. And it makes perfect sense, because as an insect, if you can specialize on a generalist plant, you're much less likely to go extinct. And this is a recurring pattern that we see in nature. The exceptions, where you have specialist interactions, are really, really uncommon. So I mentioned that Lords and Ladies cuckoo pint is probably the most specialized plant in the British flora. That is really, really unusual, in that it only has a single pollinator, and that pollinator only ever visits those flowers, and that is really, really unusual. Even in the tropics, that's really, really unusual. And the reason it works is because the plant is manipulating, is exploiting a really, really common insect, which is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Anywhere you find dung, you're going to find these flies, and there's a lot of poo in the world. So that's the strategy there. But yeah, the evolution of those kind of specialized strategies is really, really fascinating. And I say, even in the tropics, you know, where we expect to find more specialization, often that's not the case. And when we do see look at the specialists, they are specializing on generalist plants, or vice versa.
It's interesting. I wondered if you had any, because I know a lot of the orchids are very specific to their pollinators. Is that right? Or no? You're shaking. Yeah.
It's one of the great myths. It's one of the great myths.
Okay.
They're no more specialized than other groups. Well, it depends on the orchids, and you know, the orchids are the world's largest plant family by a long way, and so it varies. But we did some analyses of records of pollinators of orchids, and certainly orchids in South Africa are more specialized than orchids in Europe, for example, and North America. But Europe and North America, the orchids are similarly specialized, and not any more specialized than some of the other groups. Last year, I published a paper in the magazine, or an article in the magazine British Wildlife, which is all about some of these myths and misunderstandings.
I shall have to read that.
Yeah.
I definitely was operating under that misunderstanding.
Many people were. Yeah, many people were.
Because there's the... Oh, sorry, Caitlin.
No, I was just going to say, Kate, unfortunately, I think that's maybe all we have time for this evening. It's coming up to past. Unless you've got maybe a quick one, maybe one little...
I think we've got through most people's questions. I will say, if we have missed your question, Jeff has said that he has a section on his website. I think it was jeffollerton.co.uk, where you can, there's a little box that you can send inquiries through to. So if I have missed anybody's questions, apologies. But if you do want to visit Jeff's website and enter your question there, he said that he'd be happy to answer. But yes, thanks everyone for putting those questions in. That was great. Thank you to Jeff for such a fascinating talk. An interesting
it's been a pleasure. I was just reading through some of the messages there, and thank you all for your comments. Somebody did ask a question, Selena, asked if pollination strategy or anything to do with insectivorous plant trapping mechanisms. The answer is no. You know, if you kill your pollinators, usually it's a bad idea. And in fact, in some carnivorous plants, there's a sort of a time displacement between the flowers being produced and then the pitchers or the traps will be produced sometime afterwards, in order that the pollinators are not killed.
Brilliant. I think we're ready to wrap up then. So I will. I think Caitlin's popped in the chat our feedback form. I know feedback forms aren't the most exciting, but they really help us. As with all projects, we have to send off data to our funders and such like, and it just helps us put on more of these events and tailor them more specifically to what people are after and what people want. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much if you have filled out our feedback forms. Next week, we have our last winter webinar. Actually, Caitlin, you might have to say the date. It is next week, isn't it?
Yes, it is next week.
Is it next Thursday again?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, Caitlin herself is doing a webinar on the folklore of insects. So she's already done one on the folklore of some of our wildflowers. So she's doing some on a webinar on the folklore and tales of some of our insect species. So that'll be a must see. So do come along, register on our website. The links are up there. If you go to Buglife events, you'll find it. But thank you all for coming along this evening, and wish you a good night.
Good night, everyone.